When I was 23, I started my first business. It was December 1986. Now it's January 2024. It's 37 years, over 37 years later. And I've learned a lot since then. I've learned a lot, especially about management, managing people, and about managing myself to a great extent. Let me explain. Back in December 1986, when myself and my brother started off in business there in Dublin, in a little shop at Hart's Corner, I was a complete, total control freak. And that meant that I worked in the shop, I made the sandwiches, I hired and fired, I got into the van with the young lad, Vivian, that worked with me, and went out to Musgraves in Ballymun to the cash and carry every 2 or 3 days. I had to go every 2 or 3 days because the shop was so small that we had to keep replenishing the shelves directly, practically from the cash and carry, because we didn't actually have adequate storage. In fact, we had very, very little storage, and the shop was only 450 square feet. But I did everything then. I hired, I fired, I worked behind the counter, I made sandwiches, I drove the van, went to Musgraves, got the order, wrote the check, came back, merchandised, packed the shelves, etc., and then stood behind the counter and worked away for 17 hours a day or so on. I used to do everything. And down through the years, I had the same sort of approach, the same sort of attitude. I was doing everything in every business that I was involved in. And a few years ago there, I was listening, only a few years ago, maybe 3 years ago or so, I was listening to the radio one Saturday morning, and the former Dublin football manager, Jim Gavin, was being interviewed by Richard Curran on the business programme. And I'm a great admirer of Jim Gavin because I've seen what he's done. I've seen what he's done in with the Dublin football team, and what struck me particularly was his demeanour on the sideline when the team was going well or when the team was going badly. You couldn't actually tell. You couldn't tell the difference between when the team was going well and when the team was going badly, or when they were under pressure or at risk of losing the match, from looking at Jim Gavin on the sideline, because he stood there like this with an unexpressive demeanour. And it used to strike me, the contrast between Jim Gavin and, for example, Davy Fitzgerald, the hurling manager, who would be, to put it mildly, very expressive on the sideline and roaring and shouting and getting involved in rows with other players and with the referee and with sideline men and so on. And the difference between him and Jim Gavin was like chalk and cheese. But a few years later then, I saw Jim Gavin being interviewed by Richard Curran on the radio programme. I think the Business This Week or something. It's on a Saturday morning there on RT Radio 1. And he mentioned something which immediately fascinated me, and this was this idea of leading from behind. We've always, thought about management as leading from the front and being a good general and being full of piss and vinegar and showing the troops the way. And here was Gavin talking about leading from behind. And I listened very, very intently and closely. And I've learned a lot from it. And it's changed completely the way that I've managed now as compared with how I managed in 1986. It is 37 or 38 years later, and obviously you'd be hoping that there'd be some learning going on. But Gavin's idea of leading from behind was a fascinating one. So I actually did a little bit of research on it. But to put it at its simplest, Gavin was talking about giving his players the tools and the resources and the license in training that when they were faced or confronted with a serious problem on the pitch, in a serious game, in an All-Ireland final or semi-final, or playing against Mayo in a semi-final, or some game that was right down to the wire. It was on a knife edge. Gavin wasn't shouting and roaring on the sideline because he had supreme confidence that he had given his management or his panel, all the players in the panel, subs and everybody, the resources and the training and so on, to make decisions as they went on the fly, to deal with a crisis or to deal with the fire on the day themselves. And he had given them that confidence and he had given them that license to do that. So to go back to the management situation, what I do now as compared with 37 years ago or 38 years ago, as opposed to doing everything, I don't do everything now. I actually lead from behind now. So I have very good staff, but I have good staff, I think, partly because I give them license to do the work. I delegate. And so everything that comes in here, every task that needs to be done, I have firstly a decision to make about whether it's one that I can delegate or not, or whether it's one that requires my focus and my attention. A lot of tasks may not require my focus and attention. For example, something as simple as sending a letter back or an acknowledgement or a standard sort of a pro forma letter. Or, for example, doing a contract of employment or sending out a template contract or a staff handbook or whatever. We have policies and procedures, we have systems in place for all that. And so I don't have to get bogged down in the minutiae of the smaller stuff that I can delegate to my colleagues, to my staff here. And so that's the huge difference between what I do now and what I used to do years ago in the shop game when I started first at the immature age of 23. Now my task is to actually identify what it is I need to do and what it is I can delegate to my staff. And clearly it makes a lot of sense for me if I'm paying somebody, let's just say 15 euros an hour or 20 euros an hour to do a particular job. It makes a lot of sense if I can give certain work, certain tasks, certain responsibilities to somebody who is earning much less than the hourly rate for a solicitor, for example. It makes more sense from a cost point of view and from an efficiency point of view to have somebody who's earning, let's say, 15 euros or 20 euros an hour to do a standard letter, rather than have a solicitor who might be billing or charging 250 plus VAT per hour and upwards. It makes no sense for a solicitor in those circumstances to be doing tasks simply, quite frankly, that can be delegated to colleagues who are costing the business a good deal less. But it also gives those colleagues the freedom and the license and the responsibility and the wherewithal to do meaningful work, do more meaningful work insofar as they have more autonomy than typically that you might expect. And but as I say, the big task for me in looking at the work that comes in, looking at what needs to be done, looking at the advice that needs to be given, my job is to firstly identify whether this is something I can delegate and pass on to one of my colleagues to do or not. And in terms of delegating and in terms of getting colleagues to do work, etc., obviously everything that goes out of here is checked. Everything, letters, emails, etc., are all checked by me. So the bottom line is there is still a great deal of checking and quality control and so on. But the point I'm simply making is that leading from behind, this idea of being like a shepherd rather than some piss and vinegar general, being like Jim Gavin rather than being like Davy Fitzgerald. Leading from behind, as I say, is like being a shepherd herding a flock of sheep. A shepherd doesn't be in front of the sheep. He comes from behind the sheep and will maneuver them and guide them from behind and let the sheep do their own thing within certain boundaries. And I'm not for a minute suggesting that staff or colleagues should be treated like sheep or whatever, but I'm simply making, that's the metaphor, that's the idea of leading from behind. This is an idea, a business management idea, I think, that was developed in the last few years there by, I think, a professor in Harvard. She published an article, I think, in the Harvard Business Review, because I did a quick search there last week just to see was there any book or educational or foundational writing on it, and I think this is actually where it started, from this Harvard professor who published an article in the Harvard Business Review. Anyway, I hope you find this video useful. I hope you can see the point that I'm making, and you can see the difference between how I manage my business now and how I managed my business years ago, and how you might be able to, if you're a small business owner or thinking about starting a small business. You need to be able to differentiate between the things that you really need to do and the things that you might be able to delegate. And it might make more sense from a cost efficiency and cost effectiveness point of view. It might make more sense to delegate. In other words, if you're the chief executive or the main person in a business, etc., etc., it may not make sense for you to be spending your time worrying about putting the bins out or fighting with the bin collection company if, for example, it's something that's going to take up a good bit of your time, get you frustrated, and something that you can get one of your trusty lieutenants to do. Hope you find this video useful. If you do, I'd appreciate if you gave it a thumbs up down below. You may be interested in subscribing to my YouTube channel. If you are, just hit the subscribe button. And if you're listening to this on podcast, that is to the Irish Law and Small Business podcast, which you can listen to on Spotify or iTunes. I'd appreciate if you gave it a thumbs up or a follow or a review. Thanks a lot.